having a discussion one day about what happens when you die and what the Bible has to say about it, and various and sundry things like that. And I guess we carried that discussion to lunch, to dinner with us that day, and Mark was there, Mark Banks was there, and so he kind of joined into it, and I didn't think too much of it when it was over, and I left, I think, the next weekend for a meeting, and the elders met while I was gone. When I got back home, I got a message that the elders would like for you to do a lesson on what happens after you die, and like to do it as a Bible class on a Sunday night after services like we've done a few times. It's been a couple of years since we've actually done this. My reply was, I don't know what happens after we die. How am I going to do a Bible class on that? So, I don't know what happens after we die. Chris, will you lead us in a closing prayer? And we'll... I want you to appreciate at the very outset, I'm going to offer a couple of fundamental observations to build on, and then we're going to look at some stuff in the Bible. I'd ask you to get your Bible out. I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't have the passages up there. Devin, did you put a backside of the... So if you didn't pick up one of the Devin's lesson deals, on the backside of that, if you did pick it up, there's room for some notes if you want to take some of these passages down. This is a curious topic for human beings. We are fascinated by what is mysterious. And let's just be honest, that's the thing about it. It's the unknown that fascinates us in a lot of areas of life. I don't mean to put these things on the same level, but the reason that people fantasize and speculate about UFOs is because it's in a realm of the unknown. And this falls into that. I mean, Bigfoot, and for a lot of people, what happens after we die kind of falls into that same category. And justly so, because it is a realm where we don't know. And because of that, we latch on to that, and for some people can't let go of it. Let me offer at the outset, this is not a life or death issue. Okay? And we need to make sure, and I'm going to emphasize this again when we get toward the end, we need to make sure we keep it where it belongs. Every culture has some idea and concept about life and death, and especially afterlife. And some of these we're familiar with. We're familiar with Egyptian culture in some small ways. Now, it's kind of pop culture for us, but the whole idea of mummies and pyramids and tombs with all kinds of accompaniment, boats and chariots and horses and that are buried along with the Pharaoh, all because they believe that body is going to be once again animated, and there's going to be an afterlife, and all these things in the tomb are going to be necessary to live life. We're familiar with that. We're a little familiar, at least we think we are, with Eastern culture, that most of Eastern religions have some form of reincarnation as a part of their concept of life after death. Not all of them. There are a couple of actually fairly large religions that just believe you cease to exist when you die, and that's the end of things. But we have fuzzy ideas about the idea of reincarnation. Some cultures we're not as familiar with. You might be fascinated to learn that the Greeks and the Romans, their ideas about life after death are probably not far removed from what we think of, with the exception of they did not believe in a resurrection. Acts chapter 17, Paul gets kind of crossways with the philosophers in Athens when he mentions the resurrection of the dead, and that's pretty much when they quit listening to him. But they had a concept of what they would think of as Hades, or what they would refer to as Hades, the place of the dead, of a place of reward, Olympus, that was developed over the years to include Elysium, which the Romans believed would be kind of tantamount to our heaven, or Tartarus is what they would refer to as a place of punishment, of hell, and Hades being a kind of a place for them where you went if you weren't bad enough to go to hell or good enough to go to heaven. Okay? The Jews have a real fuzzy view of what happens after life, which I find curious because they have been the people of God in the Mosaic dispensation. And yet if you go and try to do research on what do the Jews believe, what does the Jewish religion teach about life after this, very ambiguous, very, very unclear. There are references, and most of this is fairly modern, references to what they would refer to as Gan Eden. If that sounds like the Garden of Eden, it's because that's where that concept comes from, which is a place of reward. Or Gehenna, we're familiar with from biblical references, New Testament references, which is a place of punishment. Or Sheol, which we're going to talk about a little bit as we go through our study. But for us and for the Jews to some degree and for the Egyptians and for a few other cultures, the idea of resurrection is something that we hold on to. The problem is what happens between death and before resurrection. I think that's the question that most people have. And so let me offer a couple of fundamental things that I'm going to build on. First of all, James chapter 2 makes reference to the fact that, and this is in a discussion of faith and works, that as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. I'm going to offer that as a biblical definition of actually the nature of human existence, that we have a body and we have a spirit. And when those two are together, the body is animated by the spirit, and death is what happens when the spirit leaves the body. Howard read from Luke where Jesus yields up his spirit. And so I think that is a fundamental principle that you find throughout the Scriptures, and I'm going to operate on that basis. That what happens at death is the spirit and the body are separated, and that's a biblical definition. The second thing I would offer is that there is, according to the Bible, a spiritual realm. That there is a place that's not physical, but's real. And there are beings that exist in this place that are not made of the material things that constitutes this universe. And I would offer as an argument for that the existence of God in the Scriptures, the existence of angels, the existence of demons, and all of these are so much a part of the Bible story that I don't know anybody that's going to argue that the Bible does not include those things. So those are my two fundamental principles. That death is the separation of the body and the spirit, and that there is a spiritual world that's out there or up there or wherever it is, and that there is an existence in it that includes beings that are not physical in nature. Okay, so the question then is not what do I think or what you think, but the question is what does the Bible say? And so here's what I'm going to do with this study for the rest of the evening. This may take us a while if you got stuff to do and you want to get up and leave, fine. If you just get tired of it, you want to get up and leave, that's fine. But I've been asked to do this, so I'm going to try to be as exhaustive and understand what that means, okay? It doesn't mean I'm going to exhaust you on purpose. Exhaustive means I'm going to try to cover as much as I can, and I will leave a few things out, I have no doubt. But here's the way we're going to do that. I'm going to start with the Old Testament. And we're just going to look at some passages that include these concepts that we've already talked about, and we're just going to go through and see what we can see. And then we'll do the same thing with the New Testament, and then we'll try to build a picture. Okay, is that fair enough? And so if you have questions or comments, you're welcome to them. What I'm not going to do is chase rabbits until we get to the end, if you understand what I mean by that. Devin has a list of 10 impossible questions to ask about the afterlife that I'm sure he got off of some millennial website that he pays attention to. Why he pays attention to those things is beyond me. But anyway, Devin, I'm not going to answer any of your questions until we get to the end, okay? And then tomorrow I will rebuke you severely at the office. So, okay, let's start in the book of Job. What I want to do is I want to go from the oldest references and move forward. And Job, if you appreciate Job, Job would be in chronology along with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob among the patriarchs. There's not really much mentioned prior to Abraham and Job, meaning in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. unless I've just overlooked something, which is very possible. But in Job chapter 14, I want you to notice that Job ponders the very question that we're talking about. Now, Job's argument essentially is, all these bad things have happened to me, and I'd really like to have an explanation from God because I know I haven't sinned in such a way that is so terribly bad that I've lost everything that's meaningful to me. And that's kind of Job's argument throughout the book. And when he gets to chapter 14, he ponders the life's injustices. So he starts off in verse 1, man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble, comes forth like a flower and fades away, flees like a shadow, doesn't continue. In essence, Job makes the same point Solomon makes in Ecclesiastes. We're going to die. I want you to focus beginning in verse 7. There is hope for a tree if it's cut down that it will sprout again and that its tender shoots will not cease. Though its root may grow old in the ground and its stump may die in the ground, yet at the scent of water it will bud and bring forth branches like a plant. But man dies and is laid away. Indeed, he breathes his last, and where is he? As water disappears from the sea and as a river becomes parched and dries up, so man lies down and does not rise. Till the heavens are no more, they will not awake nor be roused from their sleep. Okay, his point is, while we see things regenerate in the earth, we don't see that in humanity. I think he is lamenting the fact that man dies, and as far as our physical existence is, that's it. And if all we have is the observations around us and we don't have any revelation from God, that's a fairly just conclusion. I mean, please answer this the way I think you will. Do you know anybody that's raised from the dead, personally? Okay, everybody you know that's died, they've died, and they don't come back. And that's essentially what Job is saying. However, when you get to verse 13, oh, that you would hide me in the grave, that you would conceal me until your wrath is past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. If a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my hard service, I will wait till my change comes. You shall call and I will answer you. You shall desire the work of your hands. Now you number my steps, but do not watch over my sin. My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and you cover my iniquity. I think it's at least possible that in those verses, Job is entertaining the idea of a resurrection, that God would call him again. Now, what he may be saying is, I just can't wait till the world's over, and I wish you'd hide me and at some point explain to me. But I also think it's very possible that when you look at verse 14, I will wait till my change comes. Verse 15, you will call and I will answer. You will desire the work of your hands. That Job is entertaining the possibility of a resurrection. Okay, so just kind of file that away. What do we learn from Job and what he observed about life in his day? Well, that death may be the end of existence, but there may be a resurrection. Okay? Now turn, if you would, back to Genesis chapter 22. And let's look at Abraham, an incident in the life of Abraham. Anybody know what happens in Genesis 22 before you get over there? No? Yes, this is where God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And so you're familiar with the story. Came to pass after these things, God tested Abraham, said to him, Abraham said, here I am. Take now your only son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. And you know the rest of the story, right? Does anybody here not know the story? He goes there, he takes builds the altar, puts the wood on, puts the fire on. Isaac even asks him, where is the sacrifice? And God says, Abraham says, God will provide. And as Abraham raises his hand to kill Isaac, what happens? God calls him and stops him and provides another sacrifice. And you might go, well, what does that have to do with life after death and what Abraham thought? Anybody remember what Hebrews chapter 11 says about this passage? Anybody? Yeah, in Hebrews chapter 11, we're given some divine commentary on what happens in this passage. And I think it's important that we recognize that. And I have no qualms about putting these things together. If there's a revelation from God, then it's truth. And Hebrews 11 is offering a viable commentary on what happened. Hebrews 11 and verse 17 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, In Isaac your seed shall be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense." So I think it's important that we understand that, like Job, Abraham had some concept. I don't think he came up with this on his own. If this is something Job's mentioned, the possibility of a resurrection, and here is Abraham who thinks that the only way God's going to fulfill his promise is I'm going to kill my son, but God's going to raise him up, then please appreciate that both of these men at least entertain the concept that there's a resurrection. We're going to come back to why that's important. So there's the first two references. The third reference I would ask you to give some consideration to is in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 32. Anybody know what happens in Exodus 32 and 33? Give you a little hint. Children of Israel go out of captivity. They go to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on the mountain to receive the law from God. He's up there for 40 days, and what do the children of Israel do? They build a golden calf. And what does God's response to the golden calf? What does he tell Moses?
Kill them all.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to kill them all. I've had it with them. You know, I've dealt with them for 400 years. They've been griping. I brought them out of Egypt. They've griped the whole time. I fed them. They griped. I gave them water. They griped. And now they've defiled themselves. So I tell you what, Moses, I'm just going to start over with you, is what God tells him. And Moses, and I think God knows exactly, I know God knows exactly what he's doing. My suspicion is that this is as much a trial of Moses as it is a legitimate entertainment that God has determined he's going to do this. Because Moses begins to argue on behalf of his people in chapter 32 and in verse 30. It comes to pass on the next day that Moses said to the people, "You've committed a great sin, so now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make an atonement for your sin." Anybody, before we read on, know what Moses' attempted atonement is? He offered to sacrifice his soul. Read the next couple of verses. Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, these people have committed a great sin, have made them for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." And the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. Now go therefore and lead the people." Why is that statement important? Why is the idea that God's got a book that Moses knows his name is written in, and he offers God, take my name out and deliver these people? What does that assume? It assumes that there's going to be a judgment and that God knows who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved. He's got the names of people written in a book. And by the way, this is not the only reference. If you're interested in this concept, there's a reference to the book of life in Psalm 69. There's a reference made in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. And then most of the time we think of the book of life being where? Where do we see it prominently? Anybody? The end of Revelation in chapter 21 and chapter 20 and chapter 21, we've got God judging man, the books being opened up, and the Lamb's book of life, it's referred to at the end of chapter 21. So I want you to appreciate the implication of that. Okay, in some way, Moses believed that God was going to judge them, but it does not appear that this is something that Moses expected to take place in this life. Nor is that the case in Psalms, nor is that the case in Daniel, nor is that the case in Revelation. Possibly in Daniel, he's referring to those who have been faithful and being delivered from captivity. But the reality is, they believed that there was going to be some kind of a judgment and that God was going to sit and render reward and punishment upon people in some way, but it does not appear to be physical. Okay? The next reference I would ask you to turn to is in 1 Samuel. So flip over to 1 Samuel and let's look at chapter 28. Now's when it starts to get really interesting, folks. At least it's interesting to me. 1 Samuel chapter 28. Who's the king of Israel in 1 Samuel? Okay, Saul is the king. We learn about Samuel, we learn about Saul in 1 Samuel. And as you get to the end of 1 Samuel, and again, this is chapter 28, beginning in verse 3, what has happened is that God has rejected Saul at this point a couple of times, and the Philistines have gathered together this great army to face Saul. David has actually been fighting for the Philistines, or at least he gives himself out to be having done so. And Saul just sees his kingdom dissolving, sees it falling apart. And as you read through chapter 28, verse 3 tells us that Samuel had died. Now Samuel and Saul have been estranged, but Saul put great confidence in Samuel. It says, verse 3, Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah in his own city. Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. The Philistines gathered together, came and camped in Shunem. Saul gathered all Israel, and they camped in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid and his heart trembled greatly. So he inquired of the Lord, and the Lord didn't answer him, either by dreams or Urim or the prophets. So he says to his servants, find me a woman who's a medium, that I may go and inquire of her. And they find one. And he goes and he disguises himself. And when you get down to verse 9, she basically says, look, the king has told me I can't be doing this. And Saul says, I won't tell anybody. And so verse 11, whom shall I bring up? And Saul asked for her to bring up Samuel. In verse 12, it says, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, you've deceived me, you are Saul. And Saul doesn't care about that. He says, don't be afraid. What did you see? And she says, I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth. Verse 14, what's his form? An old man's coming up. He's covered with a mantle. Saul perceived it was Samuel, stooped with his face to the ground. And Samuel's reply is, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And basically Saul says, I was upset and God's not answering me. Verse 16, Samuel, this is the Spirit talking. Samuel, why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you, has become your enemy? As the Lord has done for himself, as he spoke by me, so the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand, given it to your neighbor David, because you didn't obey the voice of the Lord or execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Okay, what is Samuel's state of existence at this point? He's dead, by our definition. The body and the spirit have been separated, and Saul is talking to the spirit of Samuel. And Samuel says to him, tomorrow you're going to be what? With me. Now you're going to be dead, because we know in the next chapter that the Philistines killed Saul. But Samuel says, you're going to be with me. So what's the implication here? Well, clearly, there is at least, and now you can look at this with some suspicion if you choose, and that's the way a biblical critic would. But if the Bible's accurate, then Saul's having a discussion with someone who's dead, but their spirit is still in existence. Okay? So file that away. Next passage I would ask you to turn to is 2 Samuel chapter 12. Anybody know what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 11? Anybody? Should be a fairly well-known passage. David and Bathsheba. And in chapter 12, Nathan comes to David with the message from God and accuses, Devin mentioned this in the sermon this morning, accuses David of his sin. Please appreciate, this is a year after, at least a year after David's sin with Bathsheba, and we know that because of what? David and Bathsheba already have the child. And so when God is finished condemning David and forgiving David, you will notice that beginning in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 14, God says, the child who's born to you will die, And the Lord strikes the child that Uriah's wife bore to David and became ill. David pleads with God for the child, fasted, went in, lay day and night, etc., etc. They try to get David to eat. David won't do that. When you get to verse 19, the child's died. David figures that out. Verse 20, he arises from the ground, washes and anoints himself, changes his clothes, go to the house of the Lord and worship. His servants are very puzzled. Verse 21, what is this you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. And he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. And you may think, well, so what's the big deal about that statement? David talks about a reunion. I'm going to go be with the child. The child can't come back and be with me, but I'm going to go be with the child. And it's possible that that's just accommodative language, that I'm going to die like he died. But as you read and you get this picture from everything in the Old Testament, it becomes fairly clear, at least to me, that David anticipates the possibility of some kind of a reunion. 1 Kings chapter 17. 1 Kings chapter 17. Now, when we get to this section of Scripture, we're in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. Okay? And in 1 Kings chapter 17, Elijah has, by God's grace, blessed this woman in Zarephath who has helped to take care of him during this drought and this famine, and has asked God to give her a child, and she has a child. Okay? Verse 17 tells us that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick. The sickness was so serious there was no breath left in him. I'm in 1 Kings 17 and now verse 18. So she says to Elijah, what have I done with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and kill my son? And he says, give me your son. So she took him out of her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, laid him on his own bed, and cried out to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son? He stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him. Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. Here we have a resurrection picture, but we have a resurrection picture with some divine commentary. What's happening in the resurrection is the child's soul has left the body, he has died. Elijah prays that God would undo that, and the soul comes back to the body, and the child is alive again. Okay? If you go to, well, just hold on to that for a minute. Okay, so what do we learn, or what do you get? Let me ask it this way. Maybe this will wake you up. I told you that this was going to be exhaustive. What do you get from all this so far? What did most of the Old Testament characters, at least that we've read about, what did they believe about life and death? Yeah, there's something. There's something after you die. You don't cease to exist, that there is still an existence, and there is still the possibility of some kind of reunion. And I want you to appreciate, I told you a while ago, pay attention to these resurrection expectations. Because resurrection implies that there has to be some life force or life principle or spirit or soul or whatever you want to call it that has to come back and reanimate that body. When Abraham thought that God was going to resurrect Isaac, something had to happen to Isaac when he was killed, and that life force had to come back into him. So this idea of body and spirit and separation and death not causing the spirit to cease to exist, that concept is there in the Old Testament. Do you see that? Yes? You had no idea there were this many passages that dealt with this kind of stuff, did you? Okay, now let me introduce another concept here. 17 times in the Bible we read about the pit, or most of the modern versions will actually use the word Sheol. Sometimes it's the grave. Sheol is the word's translated, at least into the Greek idea, of Hades. It's, to the Jew, it was the world of the dead. And that's why it's referred to as the grave or the pit. There's an interesting passage in Ezekiel in chapter 32 where God portrays Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, as dying and going to the pit, going to Sheol. And there's where he meets the king of Assyria and the king of Edom and the king of Elam, and all of these other kings that have died are all there when Pharaoh gets there. And that was their concept. I want you to look especially at one passage in that regard. Turn to Psalm 16. And I haven't made many references to the Psalms because the Psalms are poetry, and poetry can be an intermixture of what's figurative and what's literal, and I think you sometimes have to be careful about using poetry to try to argue what we would think of as something theological or doctrinal, okay? But in Psalm 16, and the reason I think this is a safe passage is because God uses it later in Acts 2. It's used a couple times in the New Testament. David is writing this, and we already know how David feels about the son that died, right? So we already know that David has this concept. Psalm 16 and verse, let's start reading in verse 5. You, O Lord, are the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You maintain my lot. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Yes, I have a good inheritance. I will bless the Lord who's given me counsel. My heart instructs me in the night seasons. I've set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh will also rest in hope. You will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures evermore. Where is this used in the New Testament? Acts chapter 2, the resurrection of Jesus. Peter makes the argument from Psalm 16 that God said through David that the Messiah would not see corruption, and David's tomb's still with him. David is still in that tomb, but Jesus had been raised, and that's who David was talking about. But what I want you to see is David talks about existence after death. He talks about the idea that my flesh will rest in hope. You won't leave my soul in Sheol, in the pit, in the place of the dead. That there's something coming later than that. And the implications of that are throughout the Old Testament. The implications of resurrection we've already seen in Abraham, we've already seen in Job, we see it now in David. We've seen a resurrection from Elijah. There's another one in Elisha, and there's yet another one when Elisha had died, and some guys were burying another man who had died, and some raiders were coming down upon them, and in order to save them their life, they just threw the body into the grave where Elisha's bones were. When the dead man touched Elisha's bones, he was raised. Okay, so their concept about Sheol was there's a place that you go when you die. But it's not the end of things because there is the possibility of resurrection. And then one more Old Testament passage, okay? Ecclesiastes. There's a couple of things said about death in Ecclesiastes. Solomon posits the question in chapter 3, what happens to the spirit of a man? Who knows if it goes upward or downward when he dies, or whether we're dead all over like the animals. It's kind of an interesting consideration from a wise man. But when you get to the end of Ecclesiastes, what does Solomon say is the conclusion of the whole matter? Anybody? Fear God and keep His commandments. Why? For God will bring everything into judgment with every secret thing, whether it's good or whether it's evil. The idea of judgment that's held by the Jews, the idea of the book of life, the idea that I can go to those who have died, the idea that the Spirit can come back, the idea that Samuel's in existence, all of those things tend to point, at least in my mind, to the idea that they believe that there is the existence of life after death. Okay? Are you thrilled yet? I'm going to put a camera up behind me one day just so you can see you. Just remember, this is Mark Banks' idea, okay? And you're welcome to leave when you want. Okay, what about the New Testament? Here's a principle I want you to remember. When you go from the New Testament, the Old Testament, to the New Testament, you've got a huge change in culture. In the Old Testament, what are the cultures that are most influencing the children of Israel in their thinking? Okay, the Canaanites. Who else? Huh? What are the nations around them that influence them throughout the Old Testament? The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. So you have Eastern cultures with Eastern way of thinking and Eastern ideas. When you get to the New Testament, who are the cultures that are in charge? The Greeks and the Romans. Okay? And I say that because with a shift in culture comes a shift in thinking. And I will illustrate it this way. As Americans living in the 21st century, when we think about the spiritual world, and maybe this is a dangerous question to ask, but where do you think of the spiritual world as being? Okay, right in front of us, all around us. I think that that's probably a fairly common concept, that we see the spiritual world as almost a parallel universe or another dimension that's very close to us. Is that kind of the way you think of the spiritual world? How did the Jews think of the spiritual world? It's up there. Heaven's up there, God's up there, the angels are up there, everything's up there. Okay, so what I want you to, and that's why when an angel appears, that's such a shock to them. Even Paul, when he talks about hearing the voice of that he can't repeat the words, talks about ascending to the third heaven. Okay, so now I mention that not because I'm interested in accuracy, but because I want you to see how concepts can change when cultures change. Okay, we don't think of the spiritual realm the same way that they thought of the spiritual realm. And so, when you get to the New Testament, the culture's changed. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons that I'll mention as we go along, but just kind of file that away. What's the New Testament concept about life after death? Well, let's start with Jesus' comments. And the first place I would go is the place where Howard went at the table this evening, Luke chapter 23, when Jesus is on the cross, and he's talking to the thief. And the thief, one of the thieves kind of stands up for Jesus. At first they are both apparently criticizing him. One of them finally says to the other, aren't you afraid? Don't you realize that you're under the same condemnation? And I think by that he means you're hanging on a tree, and according to the Jews you're condemned and you're about to be lost, and you have no hope of association with God. And so he turns to Jesus at this point, and this is in verse 42, and says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus' reply to him is what? Assuredly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. This is a very, my dad would have said, pregnant sentence. Okay, what do we learn from this? What are the implications? Well, that there's life after death, because clearly they're going to die, but Jesus is talking about something that's going to happen afterwards. What else is implied? Well, that something's going to happen fairly soon after death, because Jesus says you're going to be with me in paradise when? Today. That there's going to be a reward. The word paradise is actually an Oriental term that the Greeks borrowed, and it means literally a garden or an orchard. Some versions would even translate it an Eden. There's a quote from a Greek lexicon that says, paradise was a quarter of heaven conceived of by later Jews to be in or just above the third heaven, which Paul talks about, 2 Corinthians Chapter 12, that he went to paradise. Okay, so it's a word that you run into a couple of times, but it implies a place of reward. And what Jesus says to this man is, this is going to happen. This is a statement of promise. And then the other implication I would offer is, who's going to be there with this thief? Jesus is. Now, you know, most people when they want to talk about life after death, the first place they want to go is the story of the Rich Man and Lazarus. And that, if you want to go ahead and turn back to chapter 16, that's where we're going next. But I don't want you to discount this statement, because this is a promise by God to a man at the point of death or very close to death about what's about to happen after they die. And it includes reward, it includes association, it includes existence, it includes immediacy, and all of these things are going to take place after death. Okay? Now you go to Luke chapter 16, and this is the passage most people think of when Jesus talks about the rich man and Lazarus. The context of this passage is Jesus' discussion about stewardship. And as he talks about stewardship and using what you have for the good of others, and that's the context, he tells this story in order to illustrate to the Pharisees the need and the importance of using what you have for the good of others, which was not something that they considered what people might say today as a salvation issue. I hear people use that language. Helping somebody else with what I have, surely that's not a salvation issue. That's what Jesus is saying. Yes, it is. So he tells the story about the rich man and Lazarus. Now, there's 2 or 3 questions about that. Are you familiar with the story? Do I need to read it? Everybody know it? 2 or 3 considerations. Number 1, is this a parable? A parable is a physical story with a spiritual meaning. Okay, and if that's the case, it doesn't mean that this is a real story. It means it could just be a made-up story. The second question is it an accommodation? We've already seen that the Jews already believed, for at least the ones that we've seen in the Old Testament, in life after death and a waiting place of some kind that the Spirit might come back and be resurrected, Sheol, the pit, the grave, and there's even the possibility of reward, that's something they understood and believed. So is Jesus just accommodating what they already believe, or, and then this is the third possibility, is this an accurate representation? And the truth is, I don't know. My opinion is that it's probably an accurate representation of life after death. But we don't know that, and I think it's important that you remember that and not make too hard or fast arguments from this story. If this is an accurate story, what it implies is there's life after death, right? The rich man dies, the beggar dies, Lazarus dies. They both go to some place where there is reward and punishment, and they recognize each other. At least the rich man recognizes Lazarus, but they are separated from one another. The rich man is in torment, Lazarus is enjoying comfort, so there is experience, there is feeling, and there is memory, because the rich man is concerned about his brothers. And also Abraham says to him, don't you remember in your life you had good things and Lazarus didn't? Okay, so what do we gather from that? Well, that's a pretty consistent view with what we've already seen. Now, I will throw this in for you to chew on. He mentions his tongue, and he mentions being in torment on a couple of occasions. So what's his form? I don't know. I don't know what the form is. He's not in a physical body. He's not in a resurrected body. We tend to think of the Spirit as being some kind of Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of existence. And I don't know what it's like, folks, but in the story, the rich man feels pain. And he describes his tongue. That's what he's asking, is that Lazarus dip his finger in water and put it on his tongue just to deliver him some torment. So you can see that there's a lot of possibilities there, okay? Now, 2 or 3 other New Testament passages during the life of Jesus. Now, I'm going to lump these together, and I'm going to move through them quickly. In Luke chapter 8, you have the story of Jesus casting out the demons of the man who has the legion of demons, which implies the idea of thousands of demons. And do you remember the story? What did the demons ask Jesus? If they can go into the swine and not into where? The abyss, okay, which is also mentioned in Revelation, which is the bottomless pit that we sometimes, and that's different than Sheol, okay? It's not the waiting place. It seems to be more probably equated to the lake of fire and brimstone, or at least a precursor to that. Okay, but what I want you to appreciate is that the demons are real, and Jesus acknowledges them. There is interaction with Jesus and demons who are disembodied spirits who are not godly disembodied spirits. Where'd they come from? How'd they get that way? I do not know, but they're not physical, but they're real. Jesus even tells a parable about how they act. So appreciate that in Jesus' day there were spirits, not without bodies, that were active. Okay? In Luke chapter 9, Jesus is transfigured. Goes up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John. Who appears with Jesus on the mountain? Moses and Elijah. How are they described? Anybody remember? They appear with him in glory. Okay? This implies one of two possibilities. They're either there in a spiritual sense, or, and this would be the more miraculous thing, and this is my opinion, they are in a resurrected body before the resurrection, because I think that's what happens to Jesus. I think Jesus is assuming his resurrected form, and that's why he still looks like himself, but he's emanating glory. In either case, what I want you to appreciate is Moses and Elijah are still alive. Okay? And that leads to the last verse that I would offer in regards to Jesus' life in Luke chapter 20, also in Matthew 22, when he's arguing with the Sadducees who do not believe in angels, resurrection, and they asked Jesus about the Levirate law. Here's a man who was married, and he dies, and his wife goes to his brother, and he dies, and there's 7 of them, and they all have her, and they want to know who she is in the resurrection. And Jesus says to them, you don't understand the power of the Scriptures. If you did, you would understand that in the burning bush passage, God says to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the implication is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive. That's not the only argument made, but it is, I think, the strongest one. Okay, so what do you get from Jesus' life? Well, in Jesus' life, the things that he said, the things that he taught, certainly seem to offer the possibility that there is an existence after death in a spiritual realm that may even involve reward and punishment while there is a period of waiting for the resurrection. 2 other passages very quickly. Turn over to 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4. And then the question is, okay, well, what's that world like if it even exists? Even if it exists. 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4 is talking about the resurrection, the second coming. And I want you to appreciate a statement that's made here. This is in verse 13. Paul says to these Christians, I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, those who have died, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. If we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. This we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord will by no means precede or prevent, the old versions, those who are asleep. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise first, and we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Notice that when Jesus comes again in this passage, he's not coming alone. Who's coming with him? Those who have already died in Christ. Now, it can't be their bodies, because when you get down to verse 16, their bodies are raised first. But they are alive, and they are coming with Jesus at Jesus' resurrection. And please appreciate that this addresses what's going to happen at the last day. There are passages that I would offer that at least raise the possibility of these souls that are still in existence even though they have died. Revelation chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 seem to indicate that there are souls under the altar that are pictured. The elders represent the redeemed in heaven. Hebrews chapter 13 offers that we've come to the assembly of the saints who have already died. So that concept is certainly there. Okay, and then the last passage I would offer to you is Philippians Chapter 1, which was brought up to me recently and as an argument that when we die we go straight to be with the Lord. Philippians 1 and verse 21, Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what shall I choose I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. So Paul has it in his mind when he dies, he's going to be with Jesus. But if you go back to the thief on the cross, that's not an unreasonable proposition because Jesus tells the thief on the cross that he's going to be with him today in paradise. Okay. Most of the time, let's get to the conclusion of all this. Most of the time when we think about life after death, we jump right to the resurrection. And clearly the New Testament, in a number of passages, teaches that our bodies, no matter what their state is, I've heard people say, what about somebody dies in an airplane crash over the sea and their body is vaporized? Well, if God's got the ability to create man out of dust, God's got the ability to reconstitute your body after you've been vaporized, you're okay. That's the argument, by the way, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Different bodies, different kinds of flesh. God's able to take care of all that. Okay? So the idea that there's going to be a resurrection, that it's going to be of the good and the evil, that the nature of the body is going to change, that it's going to be incorruptible and undefiled and unfading, that it will be glorious, that it will be like Jesus' body. Those passages are all over the New Testament. There's also the descriptions of heaven that come into play. Heaven is where God is. Heaven is a realm in the spiritual world. Jesus affirms that the earth is going to be destroyed. He affirms it in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21. Hebrews 1 describes it as well. 2 Peter chapter 3, the heavens and the earth are going to be destroyed. And there's going to be what Peter says, and this comes from Isaiah chapter 66, new heavens and a new earth. So put all that together and what happens after we die. I don't know. I just don't. Okay? What we've done is draw inferences from things that other men believed and that Jesus said. And let me make this observation to you because I think it's really, really important. We don't have to know everything, folks. These things that appeal to our curiosity, they're interesting. But let me ask you, what difference does it make to you what happens to you after you die until Jesus comes again? Is it going to change the way you live your life now? And I think that's an important consideration. And I realize that we've spent the better part of an hour talking about these things. And I've done all this because I want you to see the Bible talks about it. But the Bible never just says, here's what's going to happen. We have some close things. And it occurred to me while I'm going through all of this that the difference in thinking about what happens to us after we die, for instance, and what happens at the resurrection, which we do have some information about. The resurrection and the body that we will inhabit eternally is permanent. Life on this earth is temporary. And until the resurrection, life after death is temporary. Does that make sense to you? Whatever state we're going to be in. It's not the final state. It's not the end state. It's not where our hope is. It's not where the importance is. It's not what we're banking on. It's not where our faith lies. Our faith lies in the promise of God that He's going to provide for us. Just like He promises to provide for us in this life, whatever happens to us after we die, I have every confidence that God's going to provide for us then. Whatever we need, that there's going to be provision. And then when the Lord comes again, He's going to reunite our spirit and our body. I don't know where the spirit's going to be till then. But what's important is that we keep our faith in God and that we make sure speculation stays speculation. And here's a warning that I offer. Several times when Paul writes to Timothy, in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, he tells Timothy part of the problem going on at Ephesus is what he calls fables and endless genealogies. And he mentions fables 3 times in 1 and 2 Timothy. Do you understand what the Jewish fables were? They were stories about Bible characters that didn't have a whole story. So you take Melchizedek would be the obvious one, because we don't know anything about Melchizedek, and they come up with this neat little story about where Melchizedek came from. And the next thing you know, it's passed down from generation to generation. It starts off as just somebody's entertaining story. Next thing you know, it's what people actually believe, and people are arguing and dividing over what they believed about Melchizedek. We have to be careful that when it comes to things that God doesn't tell us about. And I would include life after death. I would include angels. I would include demons. I would include the spiritual realm and what heaven is like. God just doesn't tell us those things. They are not points, first of all, that our faith is built on, and second of all, that we should ever get so hung up on that we would possibly divide with another Christian about it. And I told Mark, I've told the elders a couple times, I'm not big on preaching on some of these things because speculation really doesn't help people very much. It does make you, and I hope what we've done tonight is cause you to, when you have a question, get your Bible out and run the references. Okay? Go look at everything the Bible had. Don't just take one passage and draw a conclusion from it. Take everything the Bible says and then see what conclusions you can draw. And I will end this way. I think Luke chapter 16 is probably, in my thinking, a glimpse of what happens after we die. I personally think there's probably a waiting place of the soul. Call it Hades if you want to. That we probably have a glimpse of where we're going to end up eternally. That there's going to be a place of torment, a place of comfort. Abraham's bosom, that's the description. And it's not only there, but you see glimpses of it elsewhere in the Scriptures. And I think it's very possible that we will have some kind of an association with God. I even told Devin, I blew Devin's mind because I said, it may be that we're in heaven, we're just not in the resurrected body. And Devin's still angry about that possibility. But what I want you to see is those are just possibilities. I can't prove that. I don't know. I can't prove what I think. And you can't prove what you think. What you can do is draw some possible conclusions based on the pictures that you see in the Bible. Here's what I know. There's going to come a day of judgment. And I'm going to stand before God and I'm going to give account of myself for the way I've lived my life. And there's going to be a general resurrection. Whether I'm good or whether I'm bad. There's not going to be a destruction and an annihilation of the evil and a reward to the wicked. Jesus makes that very clear in Matthew chapter 25, and He makes it very clear in John chapter 5. And there's going to be, at this resurrection for the faithful, a resurrection to a glorified eternal body made in the image of God, of the very nature of God, that being glory. And I'm going to be like God, and I'm going to be suited to spend eternity with God in whatever heaven is going to be. New heavens and a new earth, I have my views about that, but they don't really matter. Because I don't know about that. What I do know is I will be in a body that God has made suited for eternal association with God. And what happens until that time, I just don't know. Questions or comments? Yeah, Gary.
At the end of life, it's too late to repent.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think everybody understands once death happens that the Catholic idea of purgatory is certainly not found anywhere in the Scriptures. But that's run into a whole new direction. What I'm trying to do is say, here's what you can see in the Bible. Okay? But that's exactly right. We have to camp on what we know, folks, and that's where our faith has to stay. Anybody else? Yeah. Go ahead, Phyllis. Yes, ma'am.
We can't live in that image we've never lived in. And we're trying to mesh the two together.
Well, we're trying to understand them. Some people try to mesh them together. Yeah.
We're trying to understand it with our knowledge of time.
Yeah. We're trying to understand what's infinite with minds that are finite, and I think that's true.
So it's almost like, you know, when you have that aesthetic, you go to sleep and you don't know what's going on, and you just wake up and here you are. It's kind of like when we die.
Yeah.
There's a period of time we don't know where we are, and all of a sudden we wake up and we're in heaven.
I don't know. Maybe.
Where we are.
Maybe.
Because it's a timeless realm with the realm of time.
Yeah. Like I said, everybody's got their views and their ideas. Okay? Howard, you want to say something?
Back to the crucifixion, when Jesus said, "Today you'll be with me." That's not necessarily an inference where everybody's going to be with Jesus when they die. And Jesus had to go somewhere and remain until he was resurrected. He resurrected his body.
True.
So it was his power and his decision that could take that gentleman, that thief on the cross, with him to wherever he was going. It doesn't mean that that happens to everybody. It's I mean, kind of what I've always drawn from that.
And that may be right. And it may happen to everybody. You know, that's a problem when you start trying to draw conclusions from things that are said, and that's why I'm trying to offer caution. This is where I want us to end up. Just be careful with this stuff. Okay? Because you're trying to draw conclusions when you don't have enough information to draw a hard, fast conclusion. There's more than one possibility about what may be happening. And I would once again go back to Jesus made, the Rich Man and Lazarus story may not be an accurate story. So you just don't know, okay? Somebody else over here wants to say something. Yeah, Dennis? Well, that's true. But the question was, what happens when after we die? And I'm trying to answer that question, okay? So the answer is still, I don't know. Yes, sir. You want to say something?
What about Abraham's bosom?
Abraham's bosom in the story of the rich man and Lazarus to the Jews is the same thing as paradise, okay? Or the part of Hades where there is reward. In modern Judaism, that's what they refer to as, let me find it right quick. It's on page 1. Where's page 1? Gan Eden is what in modern Judaism, and they would consider that like the Garden of Eden, okay? So that's Abraham's bosom in the picture of Luke 16 would be the same thing in the Jewish thinking as paradise that Jesus mentions in Luke 23, okay? All right, anybody else? Okay, I appreciate you sticking with that. You know, I recognize it's long, and I know folks left, and I know folks slept, and I know folks were bored, and I hope Mark's going to listen to this at some point. There you go, Mark, okay? I'm saying that to the live stream because that's what he's going to watch later. At least he says he is. He'll sleep through it. So anyway, there you go, folks. I hope it give you something to chew on. Just be careful about the conclusions you draw. Be serious about your studying, and let's just make sure these things stay in the realm of speculation and they never become issues of faith that cause Christians to have problems about. Okay? Thanks so much. I'm done, and you're dismissed.